Doyle, Reese, and Callum thought they were just pulling off another heist. But one reckless bank job would drag them and the city's most elusive drug kingpin into the spotlight, exposing a criminal empire that had ruled Liverpool in silence for decades. Liverpool in the 1980s was a city caught between transformation and turmoil. The docks that had once brought wealth and trade to the region now carried a different kind of cargo shipments from across the Atlantic that rarely made it onto official records. While unemployment rose and working-class families struggled to keep food on the table, another economy was quietly thriving in the shadows. Beneath the neon lights of clubs and the rundown pubs on street corners, money flowed freely. That money was not coming from honest trade, but from a darker business, one run with ruthless efficiency by a man almost no one could name. He was known in whispers as the banker. Unlike the loud and violent gang leaders who fought openly in the streets, he never showed his face in the chaos. He avoided cameras, stayed out of police files, and operated through layers of loyal men who would never speak his name. To the public, he didn't exist. To the underworld, he was the most powerful figure in Liverpool. His reputation wasn't built on brute force but on intelligence. While others used fists and blades, he used patience, silence, and money. He learned early that real control came not from being seen but from staying hidden. The banker's fortune began with the city's shifting trade routes. As cargo ships rolled into the docks from South America, he arranged for certain containers to pass through unnoticed. Inside them were shipments of cocaine, tucked away among legal goods. At first the packages were small, experimental and discreet. But as profits soared, the operations grew bolder. By the mid-80s, Liverpool had become one of Britain's busiest ports for drugs, and the banker's grip tightened with each passing shipment. On the streets his presence was invisible yet everywhere. Dealers sold his product in nightclubs and housing estates, never knowing exactly where it came from. Gang wars broke out over corners and scraps, but none of those street soldiers realized they were pawns in his larger game. He controlled supply, dictated prices, and even manipulated rivalries so no single group grew strong enough to challenge him. By the time police began noticing patterns, his empire was already woven into the fabric of the city. Despite his immense power, he maintained a lifestyle designed to deflect attention. There were no flashy cars parked outside his modest home, no gold chains or expensive suits that screamed wealth. He blended into the background, often seen only in quiet restaurants or hidden offices where deals were made in whispers. To his neighbors, he was just another businessman. To law enforcement, he was an untraceable rumor. Only those closest to him understood the scale of his reach, and even they never knew the full picture. The brilliance of the banker was his ability to stay silent while others screamed for power. For years, police targeted the loudest and most reckless, hauling in gang leaders who thrived on violence and attention. All the while, the true architect of Liverpool's drug trade sat in the shadows, stacking money in hidden accounts and making moves that would shape the city's criminal landscape for decades. It seemed impossible that anyone could touch him, but in the end, it would not be drugs, weapons, or police work that brought him down. It would be a single, reckless decision, an unnecessary crime that shattered the silence he had built his empire upon. For years, the banker's success had come from caution. Every move he made was measured, every risk calculated. He understood that the real danger wasn't the police or rival gangs, it was attention. The less people spoke his name, the longer his empire could thrive. Yet by the mid-1980s the hunger for more began to gnaw at him. His drug shipments were earning millions, but the operation was expensive to maintain. Bribes had to be paid, routes secured, and overseas suppliers kept happy. Cash flow was constant, but he wanted something bigger, something faster, something that could take his reach beyond Liverpool and into the heart of Europe. That opportunity seemed to appear in the form of a rumor. Whispers began circulating about a cash depot that was lightly guarded, sitting on the outskirts of the city. Every week, vans arrived loaded with wages and business deposits. For a man like the banker, it was supposed to be an easy score. One quick strike that could inject millions into his empire overnight. The plan, in his mind, was simple. Seize the depot, strip it of its cash, and use the money to build stronger drug connections abroad. It wasn't just greed driving him, it was ambition. With Europe's borders loosening and demand for cocaine exploding, he saw the chance to expand far beyond the streets of Liverpool. For someone who had built a life on secrecy, it was a dangerous move. Robberies brought attention. They brought headlines, police investigations, and public outrage. But the banker was convinced he could pull it off. To him it wasn't a gamble, it was a calculated investment. He believed his influence and control would shield him from suspicion. After all, who would connect a refined figure like him to a messy cash grab? The planning began quietly, almost in the same way he arranged shipments. Safe houses were used to map out securities. The layout of the depot was studied. A bent security guard was bribed for inside knowledge, feeding them details about shifts, blind spots, and alarm systems. Every piece of information seemed to confirm the same thing. The depot was vulnerable, and the timing was perfect. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming before the job even began. Unlike his drug routes, which relied on seasoned smugglers and disciplined contacts, the robbery demanded a different type of crew. It required muscle, speed, and recklessness to carry out the hit. The banker pulled in men he normally kept at arm's length. Ex-boxers who were quick to fight, street thieves who lived for chaos, and petty crooks, desperate for a payday. They were loyal, but they lacked his discipline. Some of them drank too much, others gambled too heavily, and most of them couldn't stay quiet for long. Still, the banker pressed ahead. To him, the flaws were small, manageable. The promise of fast cash blinded him to the dangers. He reassured himself that the robbery would be over in minutes, the crew would scatter, and the money would disappear into his network of laundering channels. What he didn't see was how different this crime was from the rest of his empire. Drugs moved silently, quietly feeding his fortune without leaving headlines. A bank job, however, screamed across newspapers and demanded police vengeance. The decision to target that depot marked the beginning of the end. It was the moment when the banker stepped out of the shadows he had hidden in for so long and into the kind of spotlight he had always avoided. What he thought was a shortcut to more power would instead be the very mistake that exposed him. The success of the bank job depended on the people chosen to carry it out, and the banker knew he couldn't get his hands dirty. He had always operated from a distance, using others as his shield, and this time would be no different. He began putting together a crew, but unlike his carefully structured drug network, this group was stitched together from men who didn't fit neatly into his world. They weren't silent professionals, they were misfits, desperate, reckless, and flawed. Yet in the banker's eyes they were useful tools, disposable pieces in a larger game. At the heart of the crew was an ex-boxer named Doyle. Once feared in underground fighting circles, Doyle had lost his career to drink and drugs. His violent temper made him dangerous, but his loyalty to the banker was unquestionable. Doyle had worked as a debt collector in the past, breaking bones for late payments, and now he was eager for a bigger prize. He saw the robbery not just as a chance to make money, but as a chance to prove himself again, to show he was still feared. Then there was Reese, a street thief, who had spent more of his life behind bars than outside them. Reese had a talent for slipping locks and hot-wiring cars, but he lacked discipline. He lived for the adrenaline, never thinking beyond the next score. Gambling debts hung over him like a storm cloud, and every bookmaker in the city knew his face. His involvement in the robbery wasn't driven by loyalty, it was desperation. If he didn't pay what he owed soon, his enemies would deal with him in ways far worse than prison. The third key player was Callum, the insider. He worked as a guard at the very depot they planned hit. Once a man with steady work and a family, Callum's life had collapsed into alcohol and regret. He drank away his wages, his marriage fell apart, and now he was easy to manipulate. The banker dangled money and promises in front of him, and Callum gave in. He began passing along information about security routines, weak spots in the cameras, and the times when cash deliveries were at their peak. His knowledge made the robbery possible, but his weakness would later make him the crew's greatest liability. Rounding out the team were two brothers, Mick and Sean, small-time thugs who had grown up on Liverpool's roughest estates. They were muscle, nothing more. Known for quick tempers and brutal fights, they were useful for intimidation, but hopeless at staying under the radar. The banker's decision to bring them in was less about trust and more about necessity. He needed bodies for the job, and the brothers were eager for a cut. From the start, the mix was unstable. Doyle's aggression clashed with Reese's recklessness, while the brothers constantly argued with each other over who should lead. Callum tried to keep his head down, feeding information, while drinking himself into oblivion most nights. The banker kept them all at a distance, speaking through intermediaries, never meeting with the full crew in one place. He believed his layers of separation would protect him, but in reality, it only meant he had less control. Despite the cracks, planning moved forward. Maps were drawn, cars were prepared, and weapons were sourced from shady contexts. The crew spoke of the robbery as if it were a guaranteed victory, already imagining what they would do with the money. Some talked about leaving the country, others about buying houses and cars, but none of them shared the banker's vision. For him, the robbery was fuel for an empire. For them, it was an escape from the failures of their lives. The crew believed they were ready, but they weren't. They were a group tied together by greed and desperation, not discipline and skill. They thought they were about to pull off the perfect score. In truth, they were walking into a disaster that would unravel everything the banker had worked so hard to build. The night of the robbery arrived like a storm. For weeks, the crew had rehearsed every step, repeating the plan until it seemed foolproof. They knew the guard rotations, the exact minute the cash van would arrive, and the layout of the depot. Callum, their inside man, had done his part, passing along every detail he could remember. The banker stayed far away, keeping his fingerprints off the operation entirely, but he watched closely from the shadows, certain this was the move that would elevate his empire. The crew gathered in a rented lockup on the outskirts of the city, their nerves masked by bravado. Doyle paced back and forth, his fists clenched, hyped up like a fighter before a match. Reese cracked jokes, trying to hide the fear bubbling beneath his confidence. Mick and Sean bickered over who would drive the getaway van, their voices growing louder until Doyle barked at them to shut it. Callum sat in silence, nursing a flask, already half drunk but desperate to see the plan through. By the time they climbed into the stolen van and pulled balaclavas over their faces, the weight of what they were about to do pressed down on them all. The depot sat on the edge of an industrial estate, surrounded by wire fencing and dim streetlights. It looked ordinary, unremarkable, but inside its walls was a fortune waiting to be taken. Just after midnight, the crew struck. The van smashed through the gate, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Security guards barely had time to react before Doyle and the brothers were on them, shouting threats and brandishing crowbars. Reese forced open the side door of the depot, his nimble fingers working quickly, adrenaline guiding him faster than fear ever could. Within minutes, they had control. Staff were tied up and silenced, the alarms disabled thanks to Callum's inside knowledge. The crew moved with frantic energy, dragging cash boxes into sacks, stacking bundles of notes that seemed to pour endlessly into their arms. Doyle's eyes lit up with greed as he hauled crate after crate, the weight of the money confirming just how massive their haul really was. For a brief, fleeting moment, it felt like they were untouchable. Everything was going according to plan, but perfection never lasts. In the chaos, mistakes were made. A glove slipped from Reese's pocket and landed near the entrance. One of the brothers cut his arm while forcing open a crate, leaving a smear of blood on the floor. The getaway van, already old and unreliable, groaned under the weight of the cash. By the time they sped away into the night, its engine rattled loudly, a sound that would later draw unwanted attention. Still, the robbery itself was over in under 15 minutes. When the police were called, the crew was already gone, carrying nearly £2 million in stolen money. By dawn, News of the raid spread across the city. Newspapers called it one of the boldest jobs in Liverpool's history. People whispered about who could have pulled off such a daring hit. For the banker, it should have been a moment of triumph. He had orchestrated a perfect score without ever stepping near the scene. But while he celebrated in silence, detectives were already piecing together clues. The dropped glove, the blurred figure on a CCTV camera, the damaged van spotted by witnesses, all tiny cracks that would slowly widen. The robbery gave him millions in cash, but it also gave the police something they had never had before, a trail leading back to him. What looked like victory was, in reality, the beginning of his exposure. The aftermath of the robbery threw Liverpool into a state of heightened tension. The city's newspapers splashed the story across their front pages, sensationalizing the audacity of the heist and the sheer amount of money stolen. Citizens were shocked, and businesses tightened security, nervous that a follow-up strike could happen at any moment. The police, embarrassed by the ease with which the crime had been carried out, launched an intensive investigation. Every officer in the local force was mobilized, surveillance teams scoured CCTV footage, and detectives spent hours combing through evidence from the depot. What they lacked, however, was the one thing that could crack the case immediately: the identity of the mastermind behind the heist. From the start, it was clear this robbery wasn't the work of ordinary criminals. The organization, the speed, and the precision suggested someone with knowledge of both the depot's routines and the city's underground networks. Detectives suspected an inside man, and slowly their attention turned toward Callum, the security guard, whose position at the depot made him a person of interest. But identifying him was only the first step. The real goal was to trace the money and discover who had orchestrated the job. Meanwhile, the banker felt the first ripple of unease. For decades he had remained untouchable by keeping his operations quiet and his identity secret. This robbery, though successful, had thrown him into uncharted territory. Cash was now circulating that could be traced, and the crew's reckless behavior was leaving trails of suspicion. Some flaunted their sudden wealth, buying flashy cars and expensive watches, while others spoke too freely in pubs and clubs about the heist. The banker had always relied on silence and discretion to maintain control, but this time, the crew's lack of restraint threatened to expose everything he had built. Detectives began to notice patterns in the city's drug trade that connected directly to the crew. The men involved in the robbery had been long-time associates of the banker, and while they had kept their mouths shut for years about his larger empire, the robbery was different. Under pressure, even loyal associates could falter, and police realized that if they applied enough scrutiny, they might uncover the network behind the drugs and the money. What had been a shadowy empire, invisible to law enforcement for decades, now had cracks forming in its walls. Intelligence units conducted stakeouts on known associates, intercepted phone calls, and analyzed the movement of suspicious cash. Every small error made by the crew, an unreported vehicle purchase, a phone call late at night, a friend boasting about the money added pieces to the puzzle. Slowly detectives began mapping out connections, linking minor street-level operators back to a higher-level figure who had never before appeared in criminal files. For the banker, this mounting pressure was invisible to most of his crew. They continued to celebrate and speculate about their next move, unaware that each careless action was feeding the investigation. What had started as a routine heist, in their minds, was becoming a catalyst for exposure. The empire that had seemed untouchable for decades was now at risk, and the police, armed with newfound leads and an unrelenting focus, were closing in. It was in this atmosphere of rising tension that the banker's carefully constructed world began to fracture. The robbery, meant to solidify his dominance, had instead provided the first real evidence against him. What had been a carefully hidden empire, thriving in silence, was now vulnerable to discovery, and the detectives were just beginning to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. The clock was ticking, and every careless step by his associates pushed him closer to the edge of exposure. The real danger came not from the police alone, but from the cracks forming within the crew itself. Callum, the security guard who had provided insider information, had always been the weakest link. His loyalty had been bought cheaply with promises of money and protection, but alcohol had long been his refuge from reality. As the days passed after the robbery, his guilt began to fester. He had been part of something far larger than he had imagined, and the weight of what he had done pressed down on him relentlessly. Nights became sleepless, and every siren in the distance sounded like the knock of the police at his door. Callum's weakness did not go unnoticed. Detectives, following leads from the robbery, began interviewing known associates of the crew. Rumors of a man inside the depot who had helped orchestrate the job started to surface. Callum, already fragile from guilt and alcohol, was soon caught in a trap he couldn't escape. Under the scrutiny of undercover officers, he cracked. His first words were vague, a hesitant attempt to minimize his involvement, but once he began speaking, there was no stopping the flood of information. Every detail he had once held secret spilled out: the schedules of the depot, the methods of the crew, and the careful planning that had gone into the robbery. But Callum didn't stop there. In an effort to protect himself from the most severe punishment, he revealed the names of the people who had organized the heist. When asked about the figure behind it all, his voice faltered, but eventually, he gave the one name he had always feared speaking: the banker. For the police, this revelation was monumental. A decades-long mystery, a shadowy empire that had evaded detection for years, now had a face attached to it. The information Callum provided tied together pieces of evidence that had previously seemed unrelated, linking the robbery to the city's thriving drug trade. Once the police had this lead, raids began almost immediately. Safe houses that had once been invisible were raided, hidden stashes of cash and drugs were seized, and minor associates were arrested and questioned. Each arrest provided more information, more confirmations, and more connections leading back to the banker. The empire that had seemed untouchable for decades was suddenly exposed, all because of one man's weakness. Callum's betrayal, whether driven by fear, guilt, or self-preservation, had shattered the carefully maintained silence that had protected the criminal kingpin. Meanwhile, the banker remained unaware of how close the net was tightening. To him, the crew was still loyal, and the police were unlikely to link him to the robbery. His confidence in his careful planning and distance from the operation blinded him to the consequences of involving someone as fragile as Callum. The very person whose knowledge had enabled the heist was now dismantling the empire from the inside. As detectives followed the trail, the scale of the operation became clear. It wasn't just a robbery. They were uncovering an intricate network of drug shipments, money laundering, and hidden wealth stretching across Liverpool and into Europe. Every piece of information Callum had given amplified the impact of the investigation, accelerating the pace at which law enforcement could move. The cracks in the crew had become a chasm. What had started as a meticulously planned robbery now became the undoing of a criminal empire. Callum's betrayal set off a chain reaction, leaving the banker vulnerable for the first time in decades, proving that in the world of crime, the smallest weakness can destroy even the strongest fortress. The fall of the banker came with a suddenness that stunned Liverpool's criminal world. For decades he had operated like a shadow, invisible to the police and untouchable by rival gangs. His power had been built on silence, intelligence, and an ability to manipulate the city's underground without ever showing his face. But now, raids swept through the city like a storm, leaving no corner untouched. Safe houses where cash had been stashed were emptied, drug shipments intercepted, and loyal associates arrested. The empire he had built with patience and cunning was unraveling before his eyes. When detectives finally moved in on him, it was not in some dramatic raid with gunfire and chaos. He was arrested quietly, removed from a nondescript office, where he conducted his business with careful discretion. To the public, it seemed almost anticlimactic, no dramatic shootout, no daring escape, but for those who understood Liverpool's underworld, it was a seismic event. The man who had quietly ruled the city's drug trade for decades, feared by gangs and untouchable by law enforcement, had been caught in the open. The arrest sent shockwaves through the criminal community. Associates who had once looked to him for direction and protection scrambled to protect themselves. Many had hidden assets, secret accounts, and overseas connections, but the sudden exposure of their leader left them vulnerable. Rival gangs, previously intimidated by his reputation, now smelled opportunity. The streets that had long been under his influence erupted with uncertainty, fights breaking out over territory that no one could claim with certainty anymore. Evidence gathered during the raids painted a staggering picture of his empire. Kilograms of cocaine, heroin, and other drugs were seized, along with hidden cash reserves that spanned multiple properties and offshore accounts. Every transaction, every shipment, every seemingly minor connection was traced back to him, revealing a network that had quietly moved millions of pounds across the country and into Europe. Detectives discovered contracts, shipment schedules, and coded messages that showed his level of control had been meticulous. The sophistication of his operation astonished even seasoned investigators, proving that the banker's influence had reached far beyond Liverpool. As news of the arrest spread, the media painted him as a mysterious figure finally unmasked. Articles highlighted the contrast between the ordinary man on the street and the hidden criminal mastermind behind one of the city's largest drug operations. For many, the story was surreal. A person who had lived in the open yet remained invisible for so long, now exposed in a sudden, almost ironic downfall. Within the legal system, the case against him was strong. Callum's testimony, combined with the wealth of physical evidence seized during raids, left little room for doubt. Prosecutors described an empire built on fear, control, and cunning, with the bank job acting as the catalyst that finally brought him into the light. Witnesses, from former associates to minor crew members, detailed the reach of his power and the meticulous planning that had kept him untouchable for decades. For the banker himself, the fall must have been shocking. Years of careful planning, decades of operating in the shadows, all undone by a single reckless decision and a weak link in the chain. The man who had seemed invincible, untouchable, and omnipresent in the city's underworld, now faced a reality he had never truly imagined: exposure, arrest, and the collapse of the empire he had spent a lifetime building. In the weeks that followed, the city watched as his world crumbled. Safe houses were emptied, assets seized, and loyalists vanished or were arrested. The streets buzzed with the news that Liverpool's most elusive criminal had finally been caught, and for the first time in decades, the underworld was exposed, chaotic, and vulnerable. The banker's fall was complete, leaving behind a legacy of cautionary tales and a city forever changed by the empire that once ruled silently. The trial of the banker became one of the most sensational events in Liverpool's criminal history. Courtrooms were packed, reporters lined the corridors, and every detail of his empire was brought into the light. For decades, he had operated in the shadows, but now every shipment, every transaction, every hidden stash of cash and drugs was scrutinized under the relentless glare of the law. Witnesses who had once been loyal to him were forced to testify, recounting events that exposed the inner workings of a criminal network built with meticulous care. Each story, each piece of evidence, chipped away at the carefully constructed legend of the untouchable kingpin. The robbery, which had seemed at the time a bold triumph, became the central piece of the prosecution's case. It was the catalyst that exposed the empire, and the court heard in detail how the job had been planned, executed, and ultimately, how it unraveled everything. Callum, the weak link, provided damning testimony about how he had been coerced into assisting the robbery and how it connected directly to the banker. For the jury, it was a clear demonstration of cause and effect. The reckless heist had broken the silence that had shielded a powerful criminal from justice for decades. Evidence of the drug trade itself was staggering. Hundreds of kilograms of cocaine and heroin, hidden in unassuming warehouses and disguised shipments, were traced back to the banker. Offshore accounts and hidden cash revealed the scale of his operations, showing that his influence stretched far beyond Liverpool, reaching into Europe and beyond. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had manipulated people, controlled supply lines, and maintained authority through fear and careful planning. Yet, despite his intelligence and careful management, one error had undone it all. Throughout the trial, the city watched as the reality of the banker's empire came into focus. His associates, once feared and loyal, became witnesses, betraying him in exchange for reduced sentences. The audacity of the robbery, the meticulous control over drug operations, and the sudden collapse of his power highlighted a simple truth: even the most careful criminal can be undone by human weakness. The public was captivated, not just by the violence or the scale of the crime, but by the story of how someone who seemed untouchable could be exposed so completely. The sentencing was decisive. The banker received a life term, a culmination of decades of criminal activity laid bare in the courtroom. The punishment reflected both the severity of his empire and the dramatic nature of his exposure. For law enforcement, it was a victory years in the making, a triumph over a figure who had eluded capture through cunning, patience, and secrecy. For the underworld, it was a moment of reckoning, a reminder that power built on fear and silence is fragile and vulnerable to collapse. Even after his conviction, the legacy of the banker remained. His empire, once the most powerful in Liverpool, disintegrated. Safe houses were seized, remaining shipments intercepted, and former associates either imprisoned or disappeared. The city's criminal landscape shifted, leaving a vacuum where the shadowy figure had once ruled. Rival gangs vied for territory, minor criminals attempted to rise, and the lessons of his rise and fall were studied by those who remained. Ultimately, the story of the banker became a cautionary tale, a narrative about ambition, greed, and the limits of secrecy. It showed that no matter how careful or intelligent, no empire can withstand a single blunder that exposes its foundations. The bank job, intended to expand his power, became the very act that destroyed it. Liverpool would remember him not just as a criminal mastermind, but as a figure undone by a single reckless decision, proving that in the world of crime, even legends can fall.